low simply because I was reading a new publication that has come out from OECD of the Middle East and North Africa, which indicates that in some countries of Middle East and North Africa, SOE's contribution is as high as about half of the gross domestic product, and in some countries it's about 75 to 80%, and this means I'm talking about GCC largely. So Pakistan has a manageable proportion in terms of the size, but employment, clearly there is much more burden of employment generation at the SOE level. What I was taken aback was that to my real pleasant surprise, that Pakistan state-owned companies are also listed on Karachi Stock Exchange, but as I had said earlier also in another forum, that they constitute 1/3 of market capitalization. So I said, let me look at what is the global evidence is suggesting us. Clearly everywhere else privatization was given emphasis, so Pakistan also followed the trend. The good news is, it is not unusual for countries to have large SOE sector, so the problem is not the state-owned sector, the problem is how these are managed and run, rather than the controversy of whether you need to have a private company versus a public sector company. So what are the comparators that I looked at? As I said, MENA, the public sector contribution is quite significant. It's about half of the GDP, and in some countries it's 75 to 80% of GDP. So states do play a significant role. And when you look at OECD, the size and valuation varies quite a bit from country to country amongst the OECD members. OECD's state-owned enterprises combined value is close to about $2 trillion. So the economic weight is quite significant of the state-owned enterprises. Most of the state-owned sector in OECD countries is corporatized, even if it is not listed. But when you actually look at the decomposition between listed and unlisted, you do find that half of the companies listed on stock exchange and state holds, and in some instances state holds minority strategic stakes in companies. So what does this lead to? This leads to the fact that a lot of OECD countries have nurtured companies and listed them on the market with the intention of really trying to generate more gains out of the state enterprise companies by listing them and ensuring that their market valuation is enhanced. Now I'm going to move a bit faster. I was just trying to gain some time for people to come in. So I was spending a lot of time on the first slide, but I do see a lot of people are here. So first, as an economist, we say, is there an appreciation of the diagnostics of the complexity? And I was pleasantly surprised that the last 2-3 years budget consecutively have raised concern regarding public sector enterprises. First of all, budget for 2011 to 2012, which is the most recent that we had, acknowledged that SOEs are choking the economy. That's a pretty damning statement for the government to acknowledge. So I was looking at how does it choke the economy. First is public welfare losses. Sitting at my residence, suffering for 5 to 6 hours of no electricity and melting and using generators, it's a public welfare loss, not to mention how the poor people are managing their day-to-day life. So we are denied as public the right to basic services. Industry, as you know, I have been dealing with textile industry lately, and they have told me really, they've shared some really concerning stories on how Punjab in particular, textile industry is facing shortages of gas, electricity and water. Financial losses, a lot has been written in the press. There are lots of numbers floating, but the most authentic I would rely on is the budget that I have quoted, the last year's budget. It says government subsidized power sector losses of over 1 trillion in the last 3 years to ensure a lower tariff to consumer. Things are changing, consumers are equally suffering, and so is the industry. Steps were taken to reduce intercorporate circular debt, including the picking up of 400 billion, and there has been the losses have to be in the power sector seen both at the stock level and the flow. Okay, while we are resolving our stock problem, we have only achieved a partial resolution of the stock problem. The flow will continue to be there of this problem. And coming from financial sector industry, we worry both about the non-performing loans in the stock sense as well as the flow of the non-performing loans. And I find that while you're grappling to do one on one side, you're losing sight of the flow perhaps. And we know that IPPs have already issued a notice to the government and are invoking the guarantees. Past losses, while they may have been deferred today through the issuance of either bank guaranteed borrowings or special issuance of medium-term securities, and annually there has to be also an accommodation of the emerging liabilities. So what we have to do is, I'm more worried about our holding hostage the future generations to what we are facing today. And this is a worry worldwide, and I know Asad is going to cover this quite exhaustively as to what's going on, and our problems may seem smaller, but I think we have to look at the size and the assets and the investment levels of our country and worry about rather than just look at the numbers. So what did government do? It has taken some good initiative. It's trying to look at when was the Cabinet Committee on Restructuring constituted. Of course, this was constituted in 2007, 2008, 2009, and every time I read, it said, government has constituted a Cabinet Committee for Restructuring. And there are plans for power, railways, PIA, and today I read in one of the newspapers that yes, the Pakistan steel mill was presented in December 2001, and the newspaper talked about a very grim prospect of the plan being approved or even getting to a concluding stage. So I'm very sorry to share with you that, you know, every time I read about the restructuring, I'm more worried about the pace of the restructuring, because there's a little ray of hope and then, you know, they're 10 steps backward, it seems. Good policy pronouncements have been made to professionalize board of directors and induct professional management from the market. Also, a holding company of Gencos has been formed and independent professionals inducted on its board, and policy intentions are to transform other boards too, particularly of the power entities. Today, another news that I read which worries me is that there are questions being raised about the privatization of Gencos. So I think these are growing pains of democracy. But the growing pains of democracy are going to really, unless resolved efficiently, are going to really entail a very high cost to the economy and to public. These growing pains of democracy are not unusual to Pakistan, because, I mean, most of the Latin American countries that had sizable sector also went through that during the democratization process. But today, like for instance, some of the economies have either done away or have tried to adopt practices which are better than what we may have. The good news is that SEP and our colleagues here, Institute of Governance, the ICAP and others, are launching this awareness about the Code of Corporate Governance. It's commendable. My basic take on this is that these reforms are incomplete, partial, and you can't operate in a partial equilibrium framework, as economists would say. And implementation lacks political commitment and is somewhat weak.